it's time to bring it in. We're gonna literally bring it in. Hey, look, Professor Suddler made it too. Today's a special day, a special day. I want everyone to. A while ago on this show, David and Adena and I talked about Adena's high school basketball career, and she casually mentioned, in a way that I found exciting, that she got all the rebounds. And if you just put it together in your head, what that means, what that practically means about how she moved and how her intention was. And I feel that something like that is happening here today on the show. You agree, Adena? Is that what I feel like today?
Yes. I think I sent a text. I didn't tweet it. I was like, but there are some rich owners that I want to meet in these streets right now. Like, get this, all this smoke, all these hands. Like, I woke up. I mean, as I was doing the research for my segment, I was like, I'm angry and someone needs to get this smoke. So we're gonna get proverbial internet smoke because that's what we do. I don't want to catch none of these people in the streets. That's what it is. Let's get it. So today we're talking about the Atlanta Dream co-owner and senator. A lot of you have seen what she's been up to. How do you pronounce her name actually? Is it Loeffler? Can you help me?
I believe it's Loeffler.
All right, Loeffler. I just call her. I don't want to use derogatory terms. I am saved. I'm by our Lord Jesus Christ. So I work on that. I'm working on that. So recently she made some pretty polarizing comments. This is her tweet. The WNBA should stand for unite around the American flag, not divisive political movements like Black Lives Matter that unapologetically seek to defund the police. This is actually one of her full quotes in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The truth is we need less, not more politics in sports. In a time when polarizing politics is as divisive as ever, sports has the power to be a unifying antidote, says Loeffler, who faces November special election against 20 other candidates. And we should be united in our goal to remove politics from sports. So here's the thing, Ms. Loeffler, we're talking about an antidote, right? An antidote, and the fact is that an antidote is for a sickness. The sickness in our country is our inability to address racism and the historical wrongs, right? That's the sickness. What we're seeing outside right now are symptoms and issues to try to solve it. So if she really wants to talk about an antidote, like putting Black Lives Matter on the court, say her name on the back and making people recognize these injustices and probably go back and look at why we're here and what we can do to fix it, that's an antidote. And then we also discussed this, we don't need more politics in sport. Can someone please tell me what her profession is again? She's a senator who owns a sports team. So in my mind, I'm just like, recuse yourself. You are literally the embodiment of politics. So recuse yourself from owning a sports team. Honestly, the only reason why we're talking about her at this time, if she was a senator who owned a belt shop or a we wouldn't be talking about her, but you are a senator that owns a team in Atlanta, which, Carl, we talked about last week, you know, Wakanda, the birthplace. It is the birthplace of civil rights, but like, don't get it twisted. People like her still exist in this place. So the WNBA comes out with a statement. WNBA regarding Kelly Loeffler. WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert released the following statement. The WNBA is based on the principle of equal and fair treatment of all people, and we, along with the teams and players, will continue to use our platforms to vigorously advocate for social justice. Senator Kelly Loeffler has not served as a governor of the Atlanta Dream since October 2019 and is no longer involved in the day-to-day business of the team. But she's still an owner, right? A co-owner. And I think the WNBA statement was rather toothless. And Kathy, who's done such a great job, she's gonna need to come a lot harder than this statement. And we'll look later on, she did an ABC segment and she didn't come hard at all. And big ups to all the women in the WNBA. I don't know what it is though. I was like, this energy, you don't see this in the NBA. I don't know if it's because of the money, whatever, but get her weak ass out of the league, Natasha Cloud says. Skylar Diggins says, agree, Kelly Loeffler's gotta go, period. And then she even adds the WNBA Atlanta Dream, Kathy. And Kathy goes on to talk about how the WNBA is a players first league, and we're seeing what the players want, right? Breonna Stewart says, how is she still an owner? Bye, Kelly, keep that negative energy out of our league. Really proud of the players, not just the players, but like the big name players coming out and speaking about this. And I think it was Bomani who tweeted like, y'all sure y'all want players to have a voice? Because like, this is what it is. It's not cute, memes of Kyle Kuzma dressed in like a golden girl or things like that. It's really this. And the WNBA players and NBA players at this time, they're all united in the bubble, or the wubble, as we're calling it for the WNBA. And they're all in the same place right now. The power that they have being united and being able to talk, it's unprecedented. And I feel like we're gonna see a lot more of this. So I'll go on to this ABC segment, bear with me for a minute, where we have WNBA player and the WNBA president speaking.
And Commissioner, you received a letter today from Georgia Senator Kelly Loeffler, who's a co-owner of the Atlanta Dream WNBA franchise. Now, she's opposed to the league embracing Black Lives Matter, saying that the movement is, quote, totally misaligned with the values and goals of the WNBA, and faults them for supporting defunding the police, among other criticisms. She goes on to write, in a time when polarizing politics is as divisive as ever, sports has the power to be a unifying antidote, and now more than ever, we should be united in our goal to remove politics from sports. This is not a political movement that the league should be embracing, and I emphatically oppose it. What's your response to Senator Loeffler, and also to her call for players to instead have American flags on their uniforms? Does that at all seem to contradict her call to remove politics from sports?
Well, first, our players have worked really hard on what they wanted this social justice platform to be for the 2020 season. And we, as a league representing diverse elite female athletes, 100% support them. From that perspective, Kelly's views are not consistent with those of the WNBA and its players. And when I first took this role, I promised the players we were going to take a very player-first perspective, and that's what we represent. We're diverse. We need to support the players on the social justice platform. So, and again, I'm proud of our players that they have stepped up here with some great ideas, and we'll be working with some social justice advocates and activists and to essentially amplify what these players want to get done during the season.
Yeah, right. There's a saying that we have in New York. Right now, it costs $2.75 to get on the train. That statement and $2.75 will get you on the train, because it was worth nothing in a sense. If you're a players first league, these players have spoken, and I think we know what needs to happen, and we'll go further into it. But then what is this idea that Black Lives Matter is a political state? It's a political campaign. Like, I don't know. There's no Black Lives Matter party. There's no Black Lives Matter candidate. Like, we are really talking about people who are dying, right? We honor veterans. We honor people who are dying unjustly. And that's all the Black Lives, well, not all, but that's all that the WNBA is trying to do at this point, with these things on the court and with these things on the back of the jersey. And the fact is that, okay, so you instead want them wrapped up in a political flag, right? Because that's not political, and that doesn't make sense. Our girl, Kathy, our girl, they're all Kathys at this point in time. Senator Loeffler she's not making much sense at this point in time, but we'll go into why she doesn't make much sense, especially because she's a bad person with this insider trading, which I think you guys will get into later. It's almost like where there's smoke, there's fire. And with her, she's not necessarily a very good person.
And Laisha, earlier today, you tweeted, I can't believe I ever stepped foot in Kelly's house and shared a meal with her. It's actually really hurtful to see her true colors. I had no idea while I played for ATL she felt this way. Happy to own us as long as we stay quiet and perform. It sounds like you feel that Senator Loeffler's saying is basically tantamount statement, shut up and dribble.
Yeah, it totally is. She was great when we were around her, and, a lot of people are great with Black people when they're serving them in a different way. And that's what we've seen so often with sports, with culture, with music, is that, like, you're okay with Black people as long as they kind of stay in their place, or they're performing, or they're sports stars. And so now that we're kind of taking our power back and asking for, better policing in communities, we're asking for more resources to be poured in. I think it is uncomfortable. It's really sad to see. Like, as angry as I am, I'm really hurt, because particularly for a woman to do that as well, this kind of cuts the knife in a little bit deeper. And for her to be so divisive, I think it's really tough. And as a Black woman, as a queer woman playing in sports, you know, my existence is political, like sports is political. And so I think it was funny to ask for the flag as well at the end.
And she said something really poignant where she talks about, as a woman, like, technically Senator Loeffler is part of an underrepresented group, right? Women. But it also reminds me of the 53% of white women who did vote for Trump and why we're here. And it's because not always, but they will put their whiteness and their superiority before the league of 144 plus players that know the struggle of a woman. But hey, I'm white, so I'm better than you. And I'm going to tell you how to feel your pain and how to honor these folks. And a lot of times people have asked me, like, you know, you're a Black woman, but I actually at all times feel my Blackness. I don't know, I feel my Blackness first at all times. And yes, I am also a woman, but it's also why I relate to the struggle of the Black man. And I continue to lift them up. But I think here the senator is reminding us that her whiteness always comes first, possibly just how I walk into a room and I feel like my Blackness comes first. So that's that. Don't let me catch you in the streets. George Carl. So if George Carl, y'all, so George Carl tweeted out, "I'm learning what it means to be anti-racist. I've been naive to racism, so I'm growing. Listen to our Truth in Basketball series on race. Amazing candor and education from our guests. I've been truly humbled and appreciative." And I think if you guys don't remember the comment that George Carl made in his book about Black players and their single parent households, like, he's had his instances. So if George Carl can come to the pulpit and come to the altar on racism and see his naivety, I think there's a lot of other people out there who can and should. So shout out. I'm not giving him credit yet. I would like to hear what's going to happen with this, but I think a lot of people can learn something from the coach. Our boy D Wade, he's out here living his best retirement life. He dyed flames into his hair and also telling us that he's Black as fuck. So for those of you listening on the podcast, D Wade, this is a tweet of D Wade with flames in his hair and standing in front of an American flag, and it says Black as fuck. So shout out to D Wade.
Is this on his boat? Are we on a boat here?
I don't know. I feel like it was his house.
Okay.
I think it's a house, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Man, I wish
so
my
many
house,
rotundas, you know?
Yeah, I wish my house looked like a boat too. And I could check that out. So shout out to D Wade. And then unfortunately, the way Twitter cropped this picture, this is a photo of Bubba Wallace wearing an I Can't Breathe shirt and saying Black Lives Matter on the track with a mask over his face. And so this on July 6th, so we'll back it up, right? Everyone's favorite Twitter fingers, President Trump, he came on and talked about Bubba Wallace and said Bubba Wallace should apologize. Has he apologized? Et cetera, et cetera. Bubba Wallace respond with love, not hate, in a sense, with a note. And Beats by Dre, apparently, they were going to announce later that week that they were sponsoring Bubba Wallace, but they were like, F it, you know, Bubba's in the news right now, so we're going to come out with this news. Beats by Dre comes out with the news that says that they're sponsoring Bubba Wallace. And then, of course, Mr. Beats by Dre himself, outside of Dre, LeBron James shares his sentiments and welcomes Bubba Wallace to the Beats by Dre family. What I saw in this tweet was a consolidation, and actually Chad, my husband, he saw this. It's a consolidation of Black power within sports. Like, we got LeBron coming to the track now. We got LeBron backing up, and we got Dre backing up Bubba Wallace. I don't really think that the NASCAR community knew the Pandora's box that they were opening. And I mean, Pandora's box had bad stuff in it. No, this ain't bad. This is more of like a grab bag. It's going to be great, right? We're going to be at the track. LeBron's going to be at the track. And now you've got the support of Beats by Dre, LeBron. So I don't think it gets any better than that. And that's all.
Thank you, Adena.
No problem.
There's a one little, that right at the end there, I'm thinking about William Wesley, who has come up on the show before, World Wide West. Like, he, you know, everybody agrees this is what happened. Like, back in the early days of LeBron's career, he counseled LeBron and his friends to get equity.
Yes.
Right? They took a lot less money and a lot more equity. And now it's starting to matter, right? Like, LeBron has a lot of Beats by Dre equity. Mm-hmm. And so he, you know, he's not just saying, welcome, Bubba Wallace, we're going to work together. He's saying, no. Like I'm a big chunk of this company, right? Which is a different, that Black power consolidation has been building in a very particular way for a while. And now it kind of matters.
Yeah, and what I think is cool, I don't know if there could be another sport that has more headsets than NASCAR. So like Beats by Dre is gonna be all over that. It's gonna be
that's a great point. Yes, I'll never watch it, but it's a great point.
exactly.
Yeah. Wait, has anybody here know about Lewis Hamilton too? Lewis Hamilton is, I think, the only Black Formula One driver.
Oh yeah.
And he always wins. He's like far and away the best driver, which is this crazy thing for this, like the whitest of white sports that's based in Europe. And Chris Bosch basically is great friends with him and told me, like, yeah, we talk all the time. And Lewis Hamilton apparently has a million stories that now this Bubba Wallace thing is starting to activate. But to me, I'm like, oh, this is he's like a superhero in Formula One, and they just haven't talked about race until right now, and it's like starting to happen.
I don't want to take from Carl because he's going to say a million amazing things we're all dying to hear. But just real quick on George Karl, I got to know him pretty well while he was still coaching, and I've talked to Henry about this over the years. Brilliantly bright, like shockingly intelligent. I thought he was an old school coach, and he played for Dean Smith in North Carolina. I had dinner with him one night, and he blew me away with his stories about dealing with cancer, and then his son got cancer, and the amount of time he invested in researching cancer for both him and his son, which I can't even imagine going through that with your boy. And he really changed a lot as a man, he said. And he also told me about, he recognized his own faults as a dad, and now he was trying to kind of make amends. He will be a good ally for this cause because he is someone that he will grow, he will change, and he will study and research. And he knows a lot of people. It'd be great to get him as an ally. He'd be a valuable one in the NBA community.
Yeah, and I think, we're talking about his comment in the chat, and I'm not portraying him to be a Donald Sterling in this piece, and I don't want that to come across. But yeah, it was a comment that he made, and I think we see the tip of an iceberg, and he's probably seen a lot of his thoughts and how they affect and how they like racism. So I'm happy he's doing the work and with the podcast and with himself for sure.
Yeah.
Speaking of Donald Sterling, if the NBA did it, Loeffler, you're next.
Well, this is okay. Oh, there's so many. We could talk for 700 hours about issues that I took notes. I don't know if you saw. I was taking notes the whole time we were talking. Like, ooh, there's a lot to talk about here. But so Adam Silver, commissioner of the NBA, kicked Donald Sterling out of the league. Does Kathy Engelbert, who runs a league that has a boss in the NBA, right? Does she have the right to kick an owner out of the league? I don't, it's an honest question. I don't know. But I assume she has to get Adam's buy-in to do that.
Right, that's what I thought.
So I feel like it's really, we're looking at Kathy and she's like a figurehead, right? But we really got to look at Adam to make a decision, right? And empower her to do so.
Yeah. Carl, how are you?
Good. I'm good. No, I think with all due respect to the senator, there's a meme that's flying around the internet right now that says, if Black Lives Matter bothers you because it doesn't say all lives matter, but blue lives matter doesn't bother you, then what really bothers you is the word Black. And I think it just captures, Senator Loeffler completely, right? Like, I mean, she's been huge about coming out as sort of, anti-defund the police movement, right? But it's really because she just doesn't understand it or doesn't want to understand it. She sees it as kind of political propaganda. Her want to align with law enforcement is a political stance, right? So she is very much Blue Lives Matter in a way that she proposes it as being anti-Black Lives Matter at the same time, as if there aren't Black cops. But I digress. But but yeah, I think when I obviously being here in Atlanta, we went to a couple of dream games earlier this season before COVID, and it was just one of those things, right? That yeah, as a sport as vocal as the WNBA is, it's just it's just. She's in the wrong space to be taking these stances. The wrong space, wrong time. It's just, it's a mess. Yeah, wrong person. So, yeah, but I'm all right. Other than, yeah.
There is though, right? Like part of it, like one of the things happening here is that I think that Alicia Clarendon said it puts the knife in a little bit deeper that it's coming from a woman, right? Like I think there was a higher expectation, right? It's like maybe we can lead, maybe we can do a better job, and then she ruined it.
Yeah, but I mean, I think Adena's point is, holds weight, right? I mean, Black women and white women have not often seen eye to eye, right? I mean, if you want to follow the lead of any population, right, you got to follow the lead of Black women, right? I mean, what Black women did in 2016 election, what Black women continue to do since that moment, right, speaks what weighs in heavily, right? Like if you want to be on the good side of history, it doesn't matter if it's 2016 or 1816, right? Just follow the lead of Black women and you'll be okay.
Yes.
They're typically at the front of these things.
Are you worried about the term social justice now? I felt like it let the league off the hook a little bit there, where they could kind of say this vague term, let them back away from saying Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, no, I think we have to pay a lot of attention to the language, right? Even with, how the language of anti-racism is being co-opted, right? Ibram Kendi, who's taken, a lot of, or received a lot of attention, and rightfully so, for putting out the How to Be an Anti-Racist book, et cetera. But again, anti-racism, as a concept has been talked about for years, right? It's not that new. And typically when we think of who originated as a term is actually Angela Davis, right? And so, I mean, again, to think about Black women being at the front of these things. But yeah, Ibram Kendi, who is often at the front of a lot of these conversations around anti-racism, clearly a Black man, he recently left American University, where he had an anti-racist center to take a job up at BU. And so he'll be at Boston University starting this fall. But there was a fight over whether or not he could take the center with him, or what's going to happen at the center at American. And, so he gets his own new center that they're going to start at BU. But the center at American is now no longer run by a Black person, right? And so what does this mean, right? Like what, and so like, is anti-racism a matter of combating kind of perceptions or ideas around Blackness, or is it, going to be co-opted to kind of be, emptied out by diversity, right? Like in the same kind of way, and paying attention to that language matters, right? Because, we see what happens when diversity enters the room, right? We have diversity of thought, we have diversity of experience, we have diversity of, and it's just like, it becomes all things except Black, right? And so, my concern when some of these terms get co-opted and some of these terms get kind of, entered into mainstream is that they kind of get emptied out in very bad ways.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like doing this thing with the league on like Trump issues, right? Like I'm feeling like they're trying not to do anything that will upset Donald Trump, and they're kind of getting away with it. This Kelly Loeffler thing changes everything though, right? Because she's a Trump candidate. These are Trump issues. She's in Trump terms, right? And if you say we're for social justice, you activate no one in the White House. But if you say for Black Lives Matter, then you activate the White House, right? And I feel like there isn't an NBA investor who's on that exact rhetorical point right now, but this one right now I think is forcing. This is where I feel like bad. I sort of feel bad for Kathy Engelbert, who I bet is like, I'm imagining is getting direct advice to not take a real side here, right? To not make this a big news story, right? Whereas for Kelly Loeffler, it's working beautifully, right? She's one of 20 candidates for the runoff election, and her name is all over the headlines as being, there's a pretty decent amount of voters in Georgia, I imagine, in the Republican primary for someone who's kind of Trumpy, right? Like, and now she's getting headlines out of it. Anyway, yeah, it's I'm still advancing my theory here that they're just going to great lengths to not piss off the White House. And
I think this is kind of your petri dish to test your theory, Henry. Like, what happens when an owner comes out and says like they're pro-Trump in the NBA? Well, like, we're getting it in the WNBA first, and I think Adam Silver has a chance to, I don't want to say make an example of her, but to show exactly where we stand and tell these NBA owners like, that. Listen.
And Chris Paul said that, where players are worried about pulling on the jersey of a governor that doesn't support them, right? Chris Paul's kind of made us aware of this. And this is the week. Wait, today's Wednesday, right? So yesterday, today, and tomorrow, the 22 teams are arriving in the bubble. And the WNBA is showing them what happens, right? They're showing them how you can put your voices together and be very direct and clear. We'll see. It's going to be interesting.
She's a senator. Let's not forget that. That we should start with that. There's 100 of them, right? That's a quarter of the amount of NBA basketball players who are the greatest players in the world. There's just 100 senators. That's how much power they have. And she knows it. I'm not sure she says a word if she was just a governor, but she has got the power of the U.S. Constitution in a sense, and the president on her side. So she felt kind of gussied up to be able to say it. That's a lot of power backing behind her.
Yeah.
Carl, you did.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, to Adena's, connection, thinking about Bubba Wallace, right? Sport historian Lou Moore called it out earlier this week that Bubba Wallace has become, Donald Trump's new Kaepernick. In terms of kind of being that person that he's voicing off against and that he's, taking to Twitter and so it'll be interesting to see if, Trump does turn his attention to anything in the WNBA, right? But if anything gave him an in, right, this was clearly that moment.
Yeah, for sure. I have one more little personal theory. Carl, I know you prepared actual notes for today, so I want to honor your preparation and have you. Okay, I heard from a guy who lives in this town a while ago. He just went off about how wasteful the schools were years ago. It was like 10 years ago. I didn't even have kids in the school, more like 20 years ago. And I was like, that's weird. Like, what? He doesn't even know this much about the schools. Blah, blah. Long story short, I later learned he basically was someone who had been cheating on his taxes for a long time. I was like, oh, those things go together, right? Like first he was very selfish in filling out his tax forms, but then he has to he on some level kind of knows he's shortchanging, among others, the schools, right? So your brain kind of does this work of you have to demonize, oh, they were just going to waste all that money anyway, right? Like, my wife's on the school board now. I'm telling you, they do not have excess money. That's not how it goes. It's ridiculous. But I think maybe this is a little bit of a theme that I don't want to get all into Senator Loeffler's alleged malfeasance and whatever and blah, blah, blah. I'm not an expert on that, but I think sometimes these positions arise this way, right? Where, or this book coming out about Donald Trump from his niece, is it? Where basically if I do something terrible, I think it increases my likelihood to then demonize somebody else because I kind of have to sell myself to myself. Does that make sense? I think there's a little thing here. Sometimes when someone's just can't bring it in their heart to be generous and kind and thoughtful, it's because they did something back before that affected their view.
Yeah. It's the world is getting over, so why can't you at some point in time?
It's the old saying, it takes one to know one.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's actually kind of intros Carl. I think Gerard casually mentioned on this show, and this is how ignorant I am. He's like, oh, of course, our police come straight from slave catchers, and that's why the insignia is the same. And I nodded along, but the fact is, I didn't know that.
That's the point of the show. We're learning.
Well,
Henry doesn't. And I was wondering if you could enlighten us a little bit about this connection.
Yeah. So, full disclaimer, I am a 20th century historian, right? So typically where I take off, slavery is over. But as an African-American historian, you don't not learn about slavery, right? And so, if I had to break down the timeline of making this broad connection between slavery and the police, right? It would kind of go like this, right? It would be slavery and understanding slave patrols into the Black codes, right? And convict leasing into the 13th Amendment, right? Which abolishes slavery, but leaves a little loophole that says, except for punishment as a crime, right? Into Jim Crow segregation, into the war on crime, into the war on drugs, which bursts mass incarceration, right? And so mass incarceration is typically looked at as sort of a post-1968 phenomenon, right? That really kind of explodes in the 80s. And well into today, right? And mass incarceration, is at times a really big term to capture what's going on today, but a lot of historians, including myself, use language like the carceral state, right? Because when we use terms like the carceral state, we employ them in ways that mean of or belonging to prison, right? And so you understand that whether or not you or somebody may be serving any time inside of a jail or prison, you are still impacted by the prison state that exists in the United States, right? And that happens in various ways. That happens, one example would be in politics, right? The locations of prisons matter. When we think about where prisons are, we often think that they are out of sight, out of mind, and they're in rural counties. But the problem with putting them in rural counties and the building of prisons in rural counties is that they boost population boosts representation on a political level, except when you're in prison, you're a felon and you can't vote, right? And so there are ways in which kind of this very long history leads into kind of the current political moment in ways that impacts everybody's life, right? Like mass incarceration is something that whether or not you have somebody inside of a prison still impacts your life, right? And we have to kind of
for 1 second, Carl.
Yeah.
Like the population boosting thing. So they do get. Oh, can you explain? So the population goes up, which matters to how many representatives, for instance, the state would have, that kind of thing. But they don't get more votes where the prison is because everyone can't vote. Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, so right. So they get the population increase, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, thinking about, say, New York, right? When we think about New York, we understand New York in two ways, right? We understand New York City, and then we understand, anything above Mount Vernon to be upstate, right? But when we think about that's right. But when we think about prisons in New York, right, they go upstate, right? And even though most of these people are being pulled from the city, right, which kind of removes this demographic and the voting base out of one particular part of the city into a different part of the state, right? And so you have to understand that movement of population impacts kind of political power in various ways, right? And so a lot of historians have pointed to this kind of moment and this kind of happening as, ultimately the rise of the right and sort of this kind of backlash, right? Because when we think about who is incarcerated, we typically think about Black and brown folks. When we think about which way Black and brown folks typically vote, right, it's usually that we're moving left-leaning voters into right-leaning spaces, right, right-leaning counties. And so what you're doing is you're getting their population and their bodies to boost your population, which boosts your representation, but not necessarily having to worry about their votes, right? And so, so it's a very perverse system that needs to kind of go away. And that's just one angle, right? We can make conversations about the labor parts of it. We can make, but to the original question about the policing, right? So where police fit in this all is that, police are the frontline soldiers, right? Police contact lead to this moment, right? And so understanding police's broader connection about why they started and why they kind of exist the way they do, there is a way of making the tie to slavery, to slave patrols. Keisha Blaine, brilliant historian and a good friend of mine. That's not all, she's a brilliant historian first, and she's secondly a good friend of mine, wrote a piece for the Washington Post.
Friend of mine and a historian second, just that's what I tell people, by the way.
Thank you. But she wrote a piece recently for the Washington Post that really captures this longer history concisely, right? And how the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, who we're still waiting for justice for, by the way, right? Follow this kind of tragic pattern of racist state-sanctioned violence that has shaped the U.S. for centuries, right? And there are also really good documentaries like The 13th, right? Shout out Ava DuVernay, but also Slavery by Another Name, which is based on a Doug Blackman book. And so it came out some years before The 13th, but it really kind of gets into this earlier moment, right? Of what happens, how do police kind of evolve, especially in the South after slavery ends? Because that's the other, and this is sort of the final point on that. But, we have to for us to take the slavery and slave patrol part of the narrative, we also have to consider region, right? So this looked differently in the South than it does in the North, right? You know, there's a, his name is Adam Malka. He wrote a book called Men of Mobtown that looks at policing in Baltimore from, you know, through the period of emancipation in this sort of like late 19th century. And what he points out is that really in the North, what we see is that the police serve the purpose of reacting to growing immigrant populations, right? But these populations are typically poor, right? So their job in northern cities is often to protect white men's property, right? That doesn't necessarily, that still kind of falls in line with what the police who grow up the South and thinking about slavery and that were ties to slavery are also tied to, right? They still exist to protect white men's property. There are some crazy stories. If you look at the role that police played during slavery, like there are stories of slave owners sending police to jails to get their enslaved property out of jail, because, like, you know, who cares if quote unquote they committed a crime? They are mine, right? And so like if you look at like the police in the South during slavery, you know, forget when we go, you know, when we're free, right? But if you look at them during the, you know, they serve the purpose of protecting white men's property. And that is kind of the line that draws the connection between both the North and the South, right? So what we see in the North, you know, be it in cities like Chicago and cities like New York, is that as the growing immigrant populations kind of boom in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is that police were incredibly aggressive against them as well, right? But for the same reasons, right? That their sole purpose was to protect white property. And so, you know, ultimately what happens is that a lot of those same kind of white immigrants in particular, if we think about the Irish or if we think about Italians in certain cities, they then go into the police force, right, to become part of the state, right? And so you see a kind of rise through the police of kind of white immigrant wealth, white immigrant social mobility in ways that Black folks have just never been able to do. I was talking to a buddy about Sam Battle. Sam Battle is the first Black New York police officer, and he joins in 1911. All right, like which for a lot of people seems like insane, right? Like, you know, how, and you know, but yeah, here we are in 2020 still calling for like, well, if we get more Black cops, we can fix this, right? And it's just like the first Black cop was literally on the force more than 100 years ago. And you know, and it was, you know, my, you know, and I spoke about my uncle last time, who was a policeman in New York. At his retirement, I bought him the biography of Sam Battle and signed it off to him and told him, you know, this is his story, it's time to write yours. And my uncle, who was NYPD almost 30 years, was like, I'd never heard of Sam Battle, right? And so there's a way that, you know, all of this that we're talking about, right, about how important education is, also can actually impact, you know, if we use it from within, right? Like, you know, Black police officers in New York City should not know who Sam Battle was, right? And not know the barriers that he faced. Because it has the potential to change how then they view themselves as police officers as well, right? When they figure out that, damn, in 2020, I'm fighting the same fights that Sam Battle was fighting in 1911, perhaps that gets them to think differently about the role of diversifying the police force and how important that can, or how not important, right, that can potentially be. So, sorry.
What was Sam Battle's work life like?
As one might imagine, for most Black folks in 1911, it wasn't the best, right? You know, but he was able to, he was able to make a living, right? You know, in ways that we think a lot about social mobility and Black folks using the police force today. And for me, like, this is something, as someone who believes that we need to abolish both the police and prisons, right, that I often fight with, right? Because I'm like, you know, if we close Rikers, for example, that also means that there are Black and brown people who lose employment. Because there are a ton of COs, there are tons of social workers, there are tons of probation and parole officers who are Black and brown people. So what do we do with them? And Derica Purnell, who wrote a phenomenal piece about how she became an abolitionist in in the Atlantic earlier this week.
I just read that yesterday.
It's an amazing piece. But she said recently, she was just like, we find ourselves having this conversation about prisons and police, but we won't find ourselves having this conversation, say, about cancer, right? If we find a cure for cancer, nobody's going to say, well, what are we going to do about all the oncologists, right? Like, we prefer the cure for cancer, right? Just like, if we can imagine a world in which the police and the prisons are not the solutions, the thing shouldn't be a matter of, well, what do we do with all the Black cops and brown cops who use this as a means of social mobility for their own family? The idea there is that they will then land better jobs that, don't require this kind of very punitive state system that forces them to do work that most of them don't want to have to do.
One thing you said, Carl, about protecting white man's property, I thought that was really interesting, because when we're not their property anymore, according to the Emancipation Proclamation, then it seemed like these slaves patrols, their job or their mindset was like, let's return them still to some type of property, right? And to some type of workforce. So it's like, yes, you are not someone's property, but you jaywalked or looked at a white woman incorrectly. So we're going to return you to the fields, or return you to a white man, or perhaps, castrate you, or not, probably, I don't want to say, hopefully not the cops were castrating and hanging, but we're going to condone it at that same time. Isn't that what it seems like? Once they're not property, their job was to return them back to being some type of property?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely elements of that, because when we, 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, right? So it's 15 years before the 13th Amendment. But the Fugitive Slave Act, because by 1850, most states in the North had abolished slavery, right? And so, you really see kind of an increase of runaways really trying to make a break for the North. But basically what the Fugitive Slave Act does is it empowers police entities from the South to then chase folks in the North to ship them back to the South, right? So in that moment, what we see is kind of the federal legislation getting involved in empowering people to go outside of their jurisdiction to kind of keep this slave power kind of in a slave state going in the South, right? And this is why you have, this kind of panic, right? If you think about the movies like, 12 Years a Slave or something like that, right? Like, this guy wasn't even in the South, right? But he gets caught without papers and they ship him to the South, right? Because he couldn't prove that he wasn't not a Northerner, or he wasn't not a freed man at that point, right? And so there's sort of this instability that Black folks were walking on, including in states where slavery was abolished, because the state had this power to then reclaim your body, reclaim your person for the state's purposes. And, obviously that gets corrupted in all types of ways, because what we know is that freed people from the North, or freed people, who made it to the North, were then sent back to the South at no other, with no kind of oversight, right? There was no, it was total discretionary powers.
That, and once you've been in prison, right? Like you're basically, for the rest of your life, you exist in kind of a, well, I'm thinking about this today because Julie K. Brown, who's now like a real personal hero of mine, she's the Miami Herald journalist who wrote all the Jeffrey Epstein stuff. But the way she got into this was basically, she got enthusiastic about prison reform and started interviewing women as they left prisons in Florida to sort of see what happened, and quickly got a big lesson in sex trafficking, because like you can't get a job, right? But you need money. A lot of cases, these are single moms who have been missing for a while, and now they need money. And so like, basically she's like, if you're lucky enough to sell your body, like that's what you want to do, right? That's like one of the best ways you can get money. But of course now you're basically in slavery, like for real, right? And that's when she started learning the Jeffrey Epstein story was from these women, right? And I just felt like, in a way, this is nothing new, but like stop and frisk is recruiting for putting you in this penal system where now you're vote suppressed and unemployed, etc. Right?
Well, and then not only are you vote suppressed, right? Well, you're back in the carceral state, as Carl like to say. You're vote suppressed, but you're giving more representation, like we talked about in the jails, to the people who want to continue to oppress you. And then even at times, like with like the 13th Amendment says, your labor is continued to be used. I think we see that in California, where prisoners are fighting forest fires, putting their lives on the line for what I believe is pennies, right? They're trained as firefighters and put in a job that, I mean, you really think about a job, a privilege for them, right? But when they're released, they can't be firefighters, because like, you're only good to us when you are property, you can be controlled, but please, now you're released, please go find a job, even though we trained you for one. You can't have that one. Perhaps you can find an illegal job, right? And hence, like, these women are finding illegal jobs, and then you'll just end up right back in this state. It's very twisted, and like you said, does speak to this slave patrol and returning people's property.
Yeah, and to that point, right, I think that's why recidivism is so important, right? And understanding kind of, you know, how to help those who are then released stay released, right? You know, whether that's supporting ban-the-box efforts, right, about pulling off of applications, about checking whether or not you've been convicted as a felon. But I also think, you know, if you guys haven't seen, there's a documentary, again, about New York, but it's called College Behind Bars. They put it on Netflix now, but it's about the Barred Prison Initiative that's supported out of Bard College in upstate New York, in which they, you know, go into prisons in different states, but in particular the Bard one. And, you know, folks incarcerated are able to obtain college degrees for free, right? But, you know, it's a super selective program about who gets in, but they're not selective to the point that, you know, you can be a lifer or you can be somebody who's going to get out before you would even finish the degree, right? But the thing about the Barred Prison Initiative in particular is that what it's shown is that when folks have access to education inside of prisons, the recidivism rate drops immensely, right? I think there's a stat, and don't quote me on the stat, but there's something like, you know, it's roughly 90-something% of those who graduate or complete the BARD program never go back to prison. And then that's ridiculous, right? But then you find yourself in the, you know, free world having the conversation about, well, why do these people deserve free education, right? And then it becomes this kind of political statement about like, I can't, you know, like, and I remember even when it was getting started, and they highlight this in the film, but, you know, there were politicians who were like, well, I told my son when he turns 18, he needs to go rob a bank so he can go inside of a prison and get an education for free instead of me having to pay my hard-earned dollars for it, right? And it's, you know, it's craziness, right? You know, because nobody in their right mind would trade freedom for a free education, right? Like, and if that's what you're willing to do, you know, by all means. But
and free education,
I mean,
by the way, is a giant government initiative. Like that's we're right. Totally all for that, right? Like, yay, free education. Like, we do that.
And you know, I mean, to tie it back to basketball, like we do. I mean, shout out Maya Moore, right?
Yes.
You know, who gave up a career in her prime to kind of fight so many of these injustices happening in the legal system, who recently, obviously, you know, fought the case to get, I'm blanking on my man's name, but the exoneration.
Right.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Yeah, and like we said, definitely shout out to Maya Moore. I feel like everything, not only should it start out with, you know, we should need Breonna Taylor's killers. Yeah, killers. Well, let's just say that we need Breonna Taylor's killers, but also shout out to Maya Moore, right? And, you know, talking about this recidivism rate and how it's such a circular pattern. I was talking to Svi, who is he was part of the Mamba Sports Academy, but now it's a Sports Academy. And he tweeted how he was doing some research on something and didn't know about AI, Allen Iverson. I don't know why I feel like I have to say his name on this. The guy that we know, AI, and how AI was almost a victim of racism. Really was, though, when there was a fight in a bowling alley, he was recognized and, you know, was prosecuted. And then we started going down this list of players that we could have possibly lost to ridiculous laws. And so we were talking about Allen Iverson, we talked about Kevin Garnett and the lynch mobbing rule, and I believe it was South Carolina. And the fact is that Kevin Garnett just happened to be around a fight, and everyone's going to recognize the damn near 7-foot black man that's at a fight. So Kevin Garnett is now prosecuted. And then I also talked about Karan Butler, right? And Karan Butler being involved in a drug raid at a very, very young age and nothing to do with it. And we talk about this recidivism rate, but like for every KG, AI, Karan Butler that we know of, like how many of them just didn't make it, right? That got caught in this system, had to come back out and do illegal things. So for anyone, and I know it's not the people that listen to this, but for anyone who thinks like, why do we need to discuss these things and how are they related to basketball? Like they really are. And in the ABC segment, the WNBA player, she was like, I'm Breonna Taylor. And NBA players continuously say, I'm George Floyd. They are. And not to say that people's lives are worth more when they play a sport, but the fact is that please continue to look at these people and see the Breonna Taylors of the world and see the George Floyds and see the people who get caught in this carceral state that we live in.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Adena. I'm sorry.
No, I'm done.
I was just going to add to it. You remember the O.J. Simpson story, of course. I told this to Henry years ago. One of my dearest friends, who's my cousin, was at some kind of legal gathering. Her husband's an attorney. And at their table was Barry Scheck, who runs that DNA Freedom, whatever it's called. And this was, a few years after the OJ trial was over. My cousin Lynn, who's a pretty ballsy lady, she finally just said, I'm sorry, Mr. Scheck, I had to say something before the night's over. Like, give me your thoughts on what happened. And very professionally and elegantly, he said, obviously I can't speak on the matter, but no one should be sent to jail from that corrupt department. There is so much awfulness coming out of that place that until they fix that, which they ended up, I believe, firing Gil Garcetti, the guy in charge, and made some changes. But his point was there were so many illegal things going on in there. No one should be convicted of anything from there. I've never forgotten that because I was actually rooting for OJ, having no idea about that kind of stuff. I basically didn't trust the eyewitness that they brought in from the department. But yes, to your point, Adena, that goes on everywhere, not just big cities like LA.
Yeah.
There's false imprisonment everywhere. We know that.
Well,
I just finished.
A little bit of sorry, go ahead, Carl.
No, I was gonna say I just finished reading Lamar Odom's memoir this week, and I mean, talk about a person who was skirting that line, right? Who, up through high school and into college, and what happens with the UNLV fallout, and how he ends up at Rhode Island instead, and talk about somebody who was literally on the brink, right? About being inches away from falling down the other way, as opposed to becoming an NBA champion, right? So it's important to identify that when these folks say, yes, I'm George Floyd, yes, I'm Breonna Taylor, yeah, they 100% mean it, right? Because for so many of them, they know George Floyd personally, right? They know Breonna Taylor personally, and they, grew up with these folks.
And I think they can even possibly, you ask them a lot of times, is there a player you knew growing up that was better than you? And they'll tell you that person fell victim to the carceral state at some point in time.
It's a great point.
And there's like you earlier talked about, what did you call him? Like old Twitter fingers himself.
Oh yeah, old Twitter finger, little orange Twitter fingers, cheese little Twitter fingers.
So he basically, to people who aren't paying careful attention, he basically was like, oh, Bubba Wallace is not a hero, right? He's saying like, it's a mess. Like, it's a hoax, right? And this lets people think that it's a little tainted, and it lets Bubba Wallace not be a hero, right? That means when those NASCAR drivers walk together in Talladega, it's not this great moment. It's a little tainted, right? And so, and this is what happened to Kevin Garnett. This is what happened to Allen Iverson, right? Is like, I feel like there would be a natural blossoming of Black superheroes, right? Or just kind of, these characters, right? But now this is where we talked on Monday with Jay McManus about the voice of journalism, right? And I think AP style with both sides and like just lets us down terribly here, right? Like we're telling the story of Allen Iverson in the bowling alley. You either have to do 1,000 hours of research and write it in a very particular way that might be seen as opinion, or you're lying about it, right? Like you can't just do the 600-word AP story the next day in whatever local paper is. Where was this? This was in Hampton Roads, I think. I forget. Newport News. But I feel like we just don't have a way to talk about it quickly that acknowledges like systemic racism.
Yeah, and the same thing with Kevin Garnett, right? I think the law is called the lynch mobbing law. Like, you need to sit down before you write that article about KG and ask yourself why it's called lynch mobbing, why we continue to call it lynch mobbing, why it needs to be changed, before you write that potential NBA superstar was arrested for on the lynch mobbing rule, right? There's a lot of research. Actually, going back to Jane, there was something we said earlier, Carl, which I'm actually going to take the time out of my day and make a graphic for it. It was like, if you ever want to be on the right side of history, listen to Black women, and please share. Listen to Black women. And we talked about women who lead the fight in the fight against COVID, and how if you want to just get this done, put a woman in charge, unless they're the 53% like Loeffler, who voted for Trump in that sense. But so let's just put a Black woman in charge in that sense. But Jane did point that out. And I think we even called for Jane to exactly. She definitely ran things when we worked together at ESPNW. I was like, yeah, whatever Jane says. Because it was like if Jane says we're not playing, she's like, oh, LeBron is like, we're not doing.
Yeah.
Pat Beverly was supporter, right?
Yeah. Pat Beverly gets it.
Exactly. I'm like a Pat Beverly.
All right, really fast. Devin wants to know where we all were at the time of the decision. I'm not sure he wants to know, but it's very important, and we want to get the answer. Adena, where were you at the time of LeBron's decision?
It's the 10th anniversary today, right? It's a boring answer. I was at work at NBA.com waiting.
That is boring.
Putting a video up, so that's it.
Taking the world's most interesting league and making it very cardboard.
Yes, where amazing happens.
I was just finishing my second year of grad school, so I was probably somewhere trying not to read books or something at the time. Like, it was July, right? And so I'm trying to think. July 2010. Yeah, I had just finished my second year of grad school. I had kind of, I can't remember exactly, but I do know, I remember watching it and just being, good times.
I didn't see anything. I was flying to Vegas for Summer League with ESPN. And I had told Henry, I think in January of that year, I saw them play a game in person. I said, dude, he's going to play with D Wade. I had no idea about Chris Bosh, but I told him he's going to Miami. We were talking about what should Miami do. In fact, Henry and I talked the very next morning about, okay, what should that team look like? They didn't follow any of our suggestions, but I landed, someone texted to me, and Summer League's so crazy, I didn't even think much about it. It really was a huge deal. And he flew to see my brother the next morning because he's the team radiologist for the Heat. So I was the office manager was on TV, on his phone all the time. I called him, like, what are you doing? He said, hey, I just want to be on TV. I know the helicopter up there filming LeBron here. But it was a crazy time. Henry was working. Henry, you were working, weren't you?
I was as tired as I've ever been. I didn't sleep for like days. There's a whole drama of like what happened that week for me. I'll say this though. I tried to file a story that he was going to Miami days before, and just fought with people about it basically for 48 hours, and never really got it on the site. But one thing that came out of that was Chad Ford, who's been on the show, just emerged out of the ether and was a total hero to me. And I'll never forget that. Like I was like at a professional low point, just like, this is the biggest story I'm ever going to get in my life, and I'm not publishing it. But Chad kind of like, if you look somewhere in the archives, you can find a co-byline Chad Ford, Henry Abbott story, which is like basically to satisfy everyone involved, basically says like, no, LeBron Miami is basically what the story says, which is like weak sauce, but way better than what I was in a position of basically like, taking my toys and going home. And then after all that period, I, saw the decision in my living room, finally getting to Devin's question, and then stayed up all night the next night, publishing really based on weird chief Comic Sans and just the explosion of like Obama era online racism. I just was like, that night I was like, oh my gosh, people can't handle free agency? What the hell? Like, it was so weird. So yeah, that was I started writing a bunch of stories about that night, which was you know, fun, relaxing.
I forgot about Comic Sans.
Oh my God.
Good times.
It's a weird night. Anyway, all right, great show. Thank you guys.
Thanks, Carl and Dina.
Call you the Wall Street.
Thank you.